The jungle moon of Kavros shook under a sky of fire. Ships fell like dying stars, crashing through the thick emerald canopy. Smoke curled upward, and the ground trembled with each impact. Villages were already in ruins. Tribes ran for their lives. Stumbling through burning trees and shattered huts, the air was filled with screams, sirens, and the crackling of distant plasma blasts, and through it all, something moved, huge, silent, and full of fury. The creature had once been small, barely, the size of a house cat, with black fur and big, curious yellow eyes. Found near death in a scrap heap, it had been taken in by a human exile named Jackson, nursed, trained, and raised with care. But now it was something else, something terrifying. It stood nearly 4 meters tall, with 8 powerful limbs and muscles rippling under armored hide. Its eyes still burned yellow, but they were no longer curious. They were cold, focused, angry. This was no wild beast. It was hunting. The Varelian Royal Guard stood their ground on the edge of the jungle, their armor glowing gold beneath the smoke-filled sky. In the center of their protective circle stood Princess Sayla, tall and calm, her blue cape whipping in the hot wind. The guards watched the tree line nervously, their blasters charged and ready. Drones had been sent to scout ahead. None had returned. Now, something moved beyond the trees. Heavy footsteps cracked fallen trunks. A deep, slow growl rolled through the jungle like thunder. Then the creature stepped into view. Vex, that was its name, though few remembered it now. Black fur streaked with ash. Scars lined its flanks. Yellow eyes locked on the soldiers. One of the guards raised his weapon, panic in his voice. "Target in range! Permission to fire!" Sayla raised a hand. "No," she said firmly. "Hold your fire." The guard hesitated, staring at her in disbelief. "But, Your Highness," I said, "hold." The creature watched her now, just her. Its head tilted slightly. It didn't charge, it didn't roar, it waited. Sayla stepped forward. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Vex," she said quietly, almost a whisper. "You remember me, don't you?" The guards looked at each other. The same Vex that had ripped through outposts and silenced patrols like a ghost. She was speaking to it like an old friend. One of the guards spoke into his calm. "If it reaches the capital, we're authorized to use orbital strikes." Sayla turned sharply. "That will level entire districts. Civilians will die." "Then give the order to shoot now," the guard replied, "before it's too late." Sayla stared at the creature. Memories flickered in her mind of a time, long ago, when a human engineer lived among them. A time of peace, when she was still just a curious girl, and Vex was just a fluffy ball of curiosity, always clinging to Jackson's shoulder. But that time was over. The council had pushed the human out, fearing his strange ways and the unknown beast he kept. They saw a threat. And now they had one. Smoke swirled between them as the jungle burned hotter. Vex took a step forward. The guards raised their weapons. Sayla held out both arms. "Stand down," she yelled, then softer to the creature. "Please don't make me choose." Vex stopped. It let out a low, trembling sound. Not anger, not a growl. Almost pain. The princess took a step closer. Behind her, the guards tensed, fingers on triggers. Vex didn't move. The moment stretched thin. Then just as suddenly, the creature turned and vanished back into the smoke, faster than any of them could react. Trees cracked in its wake. The silence afterward was heavy. "Where is it going?" a guard asked. Sayla looked to the distant capital, where smoke already curled into the sky. "To the only one he still trusts," she said. "We need to find Jackson Marek." Deep beneath the thick canopy of Kavros, hidden in the dark, abandoned caves of the jungle, Jackson Marek watched the chaos unfold through an old, cracked data screen. He had been in this remote lab for weeks, watching the skies above, the flashing ships, the burning villages. His hands shook as he ran them through his unkempt hair. It was happening. The nightmare he'd tried to prevent, the reason he'd hidden himself from the Varelian Empire, was now a reality. Vex was out, and the creature he had raised with love and care, the one he had cared for like a son, was now a weapon of destruction. When Jackson first found Vex, it was nothing more than a tiny, wounded creature, left to die in a scrap heap. A little thing, no bigger than a house cat, its bones shattered, its fur matted with blood. It had been an accident, really, Jackson's decision to help, but Vex had become his companion, the closest thing he had to family after exile. He had spent countless hours in the lab, stitching up Vex's wounds, treating his broken bones, and eventually, when the creature had grown stronger, he began to train him. He never intended to make a beast, only a survivor. But the Varelians saw things differently. They wanted to study Vex, learn his origins, and replicate his biology. They wanted to use him as a weapon. Jackson refused. He had given them everything, his loyalty, his intellect, but that was not enough. The Varelians wanted more. So, Jackson had taken Vex and run, disappearing into the wilds of Kavros, hoping that the jungles would be enough to hide them. But it wasn't enough. Now, the creature he had raised was terrorizing the very world they had tried to protect. The Varelian drones had been searching for him for days, but he'd always been one step ahead. But Vex? He had been a weapon long before he knew it, and Jackson's failure to see that had unleashed something far worse than he ever intended. He stood up from the small bench where he had been sitting, a flash of light catching his eye from the lab. Window the smoke, it was moving closer. Jackson knew what that meant. Vex was heading toward the capital, toward the city that had once been his home, Sayla's home, the princess. She had been the reason Jackson had stayed, even when the Varelians told him to leave. She had been his friend, his ally, or so he thought. Jackson couldn't help but feel the weight of his failure settle deeper in his chest. He had abandoned her, left her behind when he ran with Vex. The same Varelian empire that had been his family turned on him when he refused to share the secrets of Vex's power. Jackson had no choice but to run. But now, with the city under siege by the very creature he had raised, there was no more running. He had to face what he had created, and face the woman he once called a friend. As he gathered his few belongings, Jackson's mind raced. There was no way the princess would allow him to just walk back into the capital. If the Varelians saw him, they would arrest him. The entire council would demand his head. Worse, if Sayla hadn't given up her title and loyalty to the Empire, she would likely join the hunt for him, just like the others. The thought made Jackson's stomach twist. But there was no other way. He had to stop Vex. He had to get to. The creature before it destroyed everything. Grabbing his blaster and strapping it to his waist, Jackson stepped outside the shelter. The air was thick with the smoke from burning villages, and the faint scent of the jungle that had always comforted him. But now it felt different, heavy, oppressive. He paused for a moment, scanning the horizon, his mind locking on a single point, the capital city in the distance. He needed to reach Vex, to calm him before things escalated further. The fate of the entire planet could depend on it. The princess would not understand. She had been part of the Empire's elite guard, had stood by the Varelians when Jackson had been nothing more than an experiment to them. But Jackson knew the heart of that city was still the same. It was still the place where he had met Sayla, the place where they had both once dreamed of something better. Now all of that was in ruins. As Jackson stepped deeper into the jungle, the sound of his own heartbeat drowned out the jungle's usual peaceful noises. He didn't know if Sayla still cared for him, still remembered the promises they had made. But it didn't matter. The world was burning, and Vex was the only family Jackson had left. He was going to find him, and he was going to stop him. Jackson moved through the jungle, the heat of the battle raging in his mind, as much as the flames that licked the sky. He wasn't sure what he was expecting when he set out from his shelter, but he wasn't prepared for the sight that met him when he reached the outskirts of the capital. The city he had once called home was unrecognizable. Buildings were aflame, the towering structures that once gleamed in the sun now twisted into blackened skeletons. The smoke filled the air, heavy with the scent of burning metal, and the distant sounds of explosions. Above, Varelian ships circled, their searchlights cutting through the haze, while the deep, haunting growls of Vex echoed through the smoke. Jackson gripped his blaster tighter, his heart racing as he moved through the ruins, careful not to be seen by the patrolling Varelian soldiers or their drones. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground beneath him was pulling him back. He had done this before, fought his way through the streets of the capital, back when he was still part of the Empire. But now, the fight had changed. He wasn't fighting for the Empire anymore. He was fighting for something far more personal. He was fighting to stop the monster he had raised. As he neared the city center, the sound of destruction grew louder. It wasn't just Vex, he realized. There was something else, something large moving through the wreckage, something with a purpose. Jackson took cover behind a half-collapsed wall, peering out into the open plaza ahead. And there, in the middle of the chaos, stood Vex. The creature was tearing through the Varelian soldiers like paper, its massive claws shredding through armor, its growls echoing with rage. It was a beast of destruction, unstoppable and furious. The Varelians, no matter how advanced their weapons were, had no hope of stopping it. But Jackson's heart sank. Vex wasn't just attacking out of rage, there was something more. Vex was looking for someone. His yellow eyes scanned the burning city, his head swiveling left and right. He was looking for Sailor. That realization hit Jackson like a punch to the stomach. The creature he had raised, the creature that had once been a helpless little thing, now sought out the princess, the only one who had ever shown him any kindness. Vex didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know he was being used as a weapon, but he was dangerous now, and his mind was locked on Sailor, the one person who had once been a link to his humanity, the one person who could still stop him. Jackson couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Vex hurt Sailor, even if it meant going up against the very creature he had raised. But how? How could he stop Vex? The creature was too strong, too fast, and Jackson was just one man with a blaster. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a hero, but he was a father who had failed his child. With a deep breath, Jackson steadied his nerves and stepped into the open, moving quickly but silently. He had to reach Vex before the creature found Sailor. The sound of the battle grew louder, more intense, but Jackson focused on his target. He had to get close enough to the creature, close enough to calm it down. The whole world seemed to pause as he approached. Every inch felt like an eternity. Finally, he was near enough to see the deep, confused pain in Vex's eyes, a pain Jackson had seen many times before when the creature was just a baby. He wasn't a monster. He was hurting, and Jackson knew he was the only one who could stop it. But then, out of nowhere, a sharp voice rang out from behind him. Jackson Merrick. He spun around to see Sailor standing at the edge of the plaza, her blue cape billowing in the smoke. The sight of her, standing so boldly in the heart of the chaos, made his chest tighten. She had come to the battlefield, and she was not backing down. "You've got to stop him," Sailor shouted over the roar of the flames, her eyes wide with urgency. "You've got to make him understand what's happening." Jackson's heart slammed in his chest. "Sailor, stay back. You can't. I'm not running anymore, Jackson." She cut him off, her voice steady, even as the ground trembled beneath them. "I'm not running from this, and neither should you." The weight of her words sank in, and Jackson felt a surge of emotion he wasn't prepared for. He had thought, all this time, that she had abandoned him, that the Empire had won, and that she had turned her back on him. But here she was, standing in the ruins of everything they had once known, ready to face the same battle he was, together. Jackson knew what he had to do now. He turned back to Vex, who was still tearing through the Virelian soldiers. With one last look at Sailor, Jackson made up his mind. They were going to stop this together. The sounds of the ongoing battle roared through the city, shaking the ground beneath Jackson's boots. With Sailor by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. But the task ahead was monumental. Vex was no longer the small creature they had once known. He was a terrifying force of nature, an uncontrollable predator. It was hard for Jackson to reconcile the creature he had raised with the chaos now surrounding them. Vex was not only attacking the soldiers, but also tearing apart anything that stood in his way, his claws slashing through buildings and vehicles alike. The creature had grown far beyond Jackson's control, and it was clear that his bond with Vex, once a connection of love and trust, was now a fading memory for the beast. The battlefield stretched before them like a twisted labyrinth of burning structures and wreckage. Sailor's presence beside him was a small comfort, but it was fleeting. There was no time for nostalgia. Jackson knew that if they didn't act soon, the destruction would only escalate. Vex wasn't just out of control. He was on a path toward complete annihilation. And Jackson couldn't let that happen, not when he still had a chance to stop him. Sailor was quick to assess the situation. She didn't need Jackson's instructions. She was already planning. Her voice cut through the chaos as she grabbed his arm. "We need to get close, Jackson. We can't fight him head-on. If we don't get him to calm down, the city will be wiped out." Jackson nodded grimly. He had been thinking the same thing. The stakes were high, too high for anything else to matter. Vex was no longer a frightened animal. He was a weapon, and the longer they waited, the more lives would be lost. But there was one thing Jackson knew for sure. Vex still trusted him, still remembered the bond they had. He just needed to get close enough to make the creature see reason. The question was, how? Sailor, as always, was practical. She knew the city better than anyone. She knew its streets, its defenses, its weak points. Together, they could navigate the ruins, avoiding the worst of the fighting, and hopefully find a way to reach Vex without being caught in the crossfire. They moved quickly, ducking behind collapsed structures and weaving through the debris. Every few seconds, Jackson could hear the terrifying growls of Vex in the distance, the creature still rampaging through the city. It was impossible to ignore the weight of what they were doing, what Jackson had done. He had created this nightmare. He had raised Vex, trained him, nurtured him. And now the creature was a living, breathing catastrophe, a ticking time bomb that could destroy everything in its path. They had to get to him before it was too late. But as they drew closer, a new danger emerged. The Virelians, aware of the damage their own soldiers were suffering, had begun to retaliate in full force. Their weapons were far more advanced than anything Jackson had at his disposal, and their drones were relentlessly hunting for the beast that had caused so much destruction. Sailor stopped abruptly, pulling Jackson back behind a piece of rubble. "They're targeting Vex," she said, her voice strained. "They don't care who else gets hurt. If we don't get to him fast, they'll take him down." Jackson's mind raced. The Virelians had made it clear that they didn't care about anything but power, and if they saw the creature as a threat, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him, no matter the cost. But killing Vex wouldn't solve anything. It would only send the city into further chaos. Jackson knew that if he didn't act soon, they would lose their only chance to stop the monster his creation had become. "We have to get to him now," Jackson said urgently, his heart pounding. Sailor nodded. She looked at Jackson, her eyes sharp with determination. She had always been a fighter, had always stood her ground when the odds seemed impossible. Jackson admired that about her, and now, more than ever, he needed that strength. "Follow me," she said. They sprinted through the wreckage, weaving through the crumbling buildings. As they neared the heart of the city, the destruction grew worse. The streets were filled with smoke, the air thick with the sounds of battle. Vex was close now, his growls reverberating through the concrete jungle. Jackson could see him in the distance, his massive form silhouetted against the flames, still tearing through anything that got in his way. The creature's fury was palpable, and the fear that had gripped Jackson's chest since the beginning of this nightmare returned with full force. He couldn't do this alone, but Sailor, as always, was with him. She knew what they had to do. They had to reach Vex and make him stop. As they ran, the first shots from the Varelian drones pierced the air. Sailor was the first to react, pulling Jackson down behind a ruined vehicle for cover. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low but confident. Jackson's heart raced. They had no time to waste. The drones were closing in, and if they didn't make their move now, they'd be surrounded. This was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or be salvaged. The fate of the city, of Vex, of everything hung in the balance. Jackson's hands tightened around his blaster. "Let's finish this," he muttered, and with that they dashed forward, charging, into the heart of the chaos, toward the creature he had once called his friend. The tension in the air was unbearable, as Jackson and Sailor made their final push toward Vex. The streets were a war zone, with debris from destroyed buildings scattered around them and the distant hum of Varelian drones circling above. Every step felt heavier, but Jackson knew they couldn't afford to slow down. They were close now, so close to reaching Vex before the situation spiraled completely out of control. The creature was still rampaging, his massive form moving with terrifying power through the streets, his growls echoing like thunder. But Jackson saw something in Vex's eyes, a flicker of recognition that made his heart clench. The beast was still there, still the creature he had raised. He wasn't lost to rage and destruction yet. Sailor, always practical, led the way, keeping them low and moving fast. She had become an expert at navigating through the city's wreckage, dodging laser blasts and Varelian patrols with ease. Jackson followed close behind, his thoughts racing. They had to stop Vex before the Varelians used their superior firepower to end him. There was no time to waste. They reached the square where Vex had paused, scanning the surroundings as if searching for something. Jackson knew the creature could feel them coming, could sense their presence. This was their chance. But before they could make their move, a barrage of energy blasts slammed into the ground around them. Jackson shouted for Sailor to get down, pulling her behind the cover of a nearby fallen pillar. The drones were closing in, their weapons primed. Varelian soldiers shouted orders, their voices drowned out by the sounds of destruction. Jackson's heart raced as he peeked around the pillar. There was no escaping the drones. They were too many, too fast. The Varelians had already seen them, and if they didn't act quickly, they would be surrounded. "We need to stop them," Jackson muttered, his voice tense. Sailor nodded without hesitation. She was already calculating their next move. Jackson could see the resolve in her eyes. She was ready to fight, but Jackson knew that if they fought now, they wouldn't be able to reach Vex. They would be distracted, and the opportunity would slip away. He had to take a different approach. "I'll create a diversion," he said, turning to Sailor. "You get to Vex. He's our only shot." Sailor hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the risks. "Jackson, this isn't a time for you." "Can do this," Jackson interrupted, his voice firm. "You're the only one who can reach him now. I'll make sure you have a clear path." Sailor looked at him, her gaze intense and filled with trust. Without another word, she nodded and began moving into position. Jackson didn't wait. He grabbed a small device from his belt, a flare he had scavenged from a fallen Varelian soldier earlier. He activated it, sending it high into the air. The flare erupted into a blinding light, drawing the attention of the drones and soldiers toward him. The moment the drones turned to follow the flare's path, Jackson sprinted for cover, his heart pounding. The distraction worked. The drones veered off course, firing at the flare as it flew farther into the air. Jackson used the chaos to his advantage, darting from one piece of cover to another, staying low and out of sight. He could hear the faint hum of the drones overhead, but he kept moving, keeping the soldiers occupied. Meanwhile, Sailor was moving toward Vex, her eyes focused and steady. She had always been a warrior at heart, and Jackson trusted her to do what needed to be done. He knew she understood the risk. Vex wasn't just an animal anymore. He was a force of nature, and his rage was like nothing they had ever faced. But Sailor had a bond with him that was far stronger than any weapon. She had known the creature in ways Jackson never could. As she approached, Vex finally turned his massive head, locking eyes with her. The intensity of their gaze made Jackson freeze. It was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when everything could go either way. Would Vex attack, tearing through everything in his path, or would he remember the bond they had once shared? Sailor didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, speaking softly, her voice reaching the creature's ears over the noise of the battlefield. "Vex," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I know you can hear me. I know you remember me." For a moment, it seemed as if Vex was going to charge, his muscles tensing, his claws raising in the air. But then, something shifted in his eyes. The wildness faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He wasn't attacking, he was listening. Jackson, still behind cover, watched in disbelief. It was working. Sailor's words were reaching him. But before he could feel any relief, the situation took a dangerous turn. A new group of Virelian soldiers appeared, and they weren't focused on the chaos surrounding them. They were focused entirely on Vex. They had decided in that moment that the creature was too much of a threat to be allowed to live. Without warning, they raised their weapons and fired at the beast. Jackson's heart stopped. Vex roared, a sound of pure agony and fury as the blasts hit his side. But instead of retreating, instead of fleeing, the creature charged at the soldiers with a terrifying speed. Sailor barely managed to leap out of the way as Vex tore into the soldiers with deadly precision. The moment of calm had shattered, and now they were faced with the full force of Vex's wrath once again. But this time, it was different. Sailor was there, Jackson was there, and together they would fight to the very end. The chaos that had erupted was unimaginable, and Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness as he watched Sailor and Vex fight side by side. The creature was unstoppable now, his movements fueled by a mix of rage and survival instincts. His massive claws tore through the Virelian soldiers like paper, the ground shaking beneath their every step. Sailor, agile and quick, darted in and out of the fray, using her weapons and training to strike at the soldiers who tried to take down the beast. It was clear that Vex wasn't just an animal anymore. He was a force of nature, a terrifying predator that couldn't be stopped, not even by the might of the Virelian army. Jackson's heart was heavy with guilt. This was his fault. He had raised Vex, taught him to be strong, to protect himself. But now, his creation had become a living nightmare, and Jackson wasn't sure if there was any coming back from it. The Virelian soldiers were relentless, their superior technology making them formidable opponents. But they were no match for Vex's raw power and the fierce determination of Sailor. As they fought, Jackson could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. There was no time to think, no time to reflect on what had gone wrong. They were in the midst of a battle for survival, and every second counted. The Virelian drones circled above them, constantly scanning for targets, their weapons locked onto anything that moved. Jackson knew they couldn't keep fighting like this forever. Eventually, the Virelians would overwhelm them with sheer numbers and firepower. Sailor, still in the thick of it, called out to Jackson, "We need to fall back. We can't win this if we stay here." She was right. The longer they stayed, the more they risked being cornered. Jackson knew they had to retreat, regroup, and come up with a plan to take down the Virelian threat once and for all. But how could they stop the monster he had created? How could they possibly stop Vex without destroying him? The thought of losing the creature, the only thing left of the bond they had shared, gnawed at Jackson's insides. But they couldn't afford to hesitate. Sailor was already leading the way, maneuvering through the wreckage with the precision of someone who had fought countless battles. Vex, though still in a frenzy, followed her, his large body crashing through the remains of buildings and vehicles. Jackson kept close behind, trying to keep up with the pace, all while keeping an eye on the approaching Varelian forces. They had to get to safety. Once they were out of the immediate danger zone, Jackson and Sailor would have a chance to formulate a plan. But they needed time. Time to think. Time to strategize. The streets were a labyrinth of destruction. But Sailor's knowledge of the city's layout was invaluable. She led them down alleys and through hidden passageways, avoiding the main roads where the fighting was heaviest. The sounds of battle gradually began to fade as they put more distance between themselves and the front lines. Jackson's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't just allow Vex to keep destroying everything in his path. But the creature was out of control, and Jackson didn't know how to fix it. As they reached a temporary safe house, Jackson slammed the door behind them, sealing them in. Sailor immediately started to work assessing their situation. "We need to find a way to stop Vex before he destroys everything. He's too dangerous now." Her words hit Jackson like a ton of bricks. She was right. Vex had become more than just a threat. He had become the ultimate weapon, and the longer they waited, the more likely it was that the Varelians would be able to eliminate him entirely. Jackson paced the room, trying to think. His thoughts kept returning to the bond he once had with Vex. There had to be something that could still reach him, some way to get through to the creature. He couldn't accept that all the time he had spent raising Vex had been for nothing. But the options were limited. The Varelians were relentless, and if they couldn't stop the beast, they would all be wiped out. They had to act quickly. Sailor's voice brought him out of his thoughts. "I've got an idea," she said. Jackson looked at her, hope flickering in his chest. She was always the strategist, the one who could find a way out of impossible situations. Sailor quickly began to sketch out a plan. "If we can lure Vex into a trap, something that will contain him without hurting him, we might be able to force him to calm down. But it has to be something that doesn't trigger his instincts to fight." The idea made sense, but Jackson couldn't help but feel uneasy. Vex had been nothing but a wild force of nature since the moment the Varelians started their assault. But Sailor was right. They had no other choice. If they didn't do something soon, Vex would destroy everything, including himself. Jackson nodded, steeling himself. "Let's do it." They spent the next few hours preparing, making sure they had the tools and resources needed to implement the plan. Jackson was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. The fate of Vex, the city, and their future was riding on their ability to outsmart the Varelians and their own creation. When the time came, Jackson felt the weight of it all. He wasn't sure if this would work, but he knew. One thing for certain, it was their only chance. The tension in the air was palpable as Jackson and Sailor prepared to execute their plan to contain Vex. They had spent hours gathering everything they needed: a series of electromagnetic pulse, EMP devices, a few traps capable of temporarily immobilizing the creature, and a special tranquilizer dart that could potentially calm him down. But there was no certainty. Vex had become a terrifying predator, a being of immense power whose mind was clouded with rage. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what they tried, the creature he had raised, the one he had cared for, might not respond to their attempts to stop him. Sailor, ever the tactician, was ready. She moved with quick, practiced steps, setting the traps in strategic locations throughout the area where they would face Vex. She knew they couldn't afford to fail. Not this time. They only had one shot at this. They needed to lure Vex into the trap, but it wasn't going to be easy. Jackson could already hear the sounds of destruction in the distance, the roar of the beast tearing through the city, the screams of Virelian soldiers as they tried to contain him. It wasn't just the creature they had to worry about now. The Virelians were closing in, their drones and soldiers all converging on the area. Jackson knew that time was running out. They had to act fast. As the sound of Vex's rampage grew louder, Jackson's heart raced. He stepped into the makeshift command center they had set up, looking at the monitors that showed the creature's progress. He could see Vex in the distance, moving closer to their location with terrifying speed. The creature was unstoppable now, a nightmare unleashed on the city. Jackson's thoughts flickered back to the creature's origins. He had raised Vex from a tiny, fragile being. He had fed him, trained him, and watched him grow into a powerful creature. But somewhere along the way, things had gone wrong. The Virelian invasion had triggered something deep within Vex, a primal rage that even Jackson couldn't control. Now they were faced with a creature they could no longer contain, and Jackson felt the weight of that responsibility. The plan they had devised was risky. The traps were powerful, but they could only hold Vex for a short time. The EMP devices would be their only hope of disorienting him long enough for them to get close enough to use the tranquilizer dart. But if Vex wasn't calmed down, they would have no choice but to fight him, and Jackson wasn't sure they could win that battle. "Jackson, it's time!" Sailor's voice crackled through the comms, breaking his chain of thought. He nodded, his nerves tightening. This was it. The moment they had been preparing for had finally arrived. Vex was close now, his massive form easily visible on the horizon. Sailor moved into position, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Jackson followed her lead, moving cautiously through the broken buildings and debris that littered the streets. They had to remain unseen. If Vex saw them before they were in position, the plan would fail. They crouched behind an old tank, the thick metal providing cover as they waited. The sound of Vex's growls grew louder, and Jackson's pulse quickened. He could feel the heat of the creature's presence, the raw power that radiated from him, and every instinct in Jackson told him to run, to get as far away from the beast as possible, but he couldn't. Vex was his responsibility. He had to stop him, or the creature would destroy everything in his path. As they waited, the Virelian soldiers began to close in, taking up positions around the area. Jackson could see their weapons aimed at the horizon, ready to fire on anything that moved. The drones were overhead, their sensors scanning the area for signs of life. Jackson's heart hammered in his chest as the tension grew. It was only a matter of time before the Virelians noticed the two of them. But just as he feared they had been spotted, Vex appeared, his enormous form emerging from the smoke and dust. The creature's eyes locked onto Jackson, a flicker of recognition shining through the fury. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. Jackson moved quickly, signaling to Sailor. They were ready. Sailor activated the first EMP device, sending a powerful pulse through the air. Vex immediately staggered, his massive body jerking as the electromagnetic pulse scrambled his senses. The roar he let out was a mix of confusion and pain. Jackson saw his opportunity and moved forward, darting from cover to cover. Sailor continued to move, positioning herself in a way that would allow her to fire the tranquilizer dart when the time came. But the moment wasn't easy. Vex was disoriented, but he wasn't incapacitated. He continued to lash out, swiping at the air with his massive claws. Jackson knew that if they didn't act quickly, he would snap back into his rage, and all their efforts would be for nothing. Sailor fired another EMP, and this time Vex seemed to stumble, his massive frame crashing into a nearby building. It was the opening they needed. Jackson rushed forward, Sailor right behind him. As Vex struggled to regain his footing, Sailor fired the tranquilizer dart, her aim true. The dart sank into Vex's side, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, The creature's furious growls softened, and his movements slowed. Jackson held his breath as he watched, waiting for the tranquilizer to take effect. It took a few agonizing moments, but eventually Vex collapsed to the ground, his massive form crumpling in a heap. The creature was unconscious, but Jackson knew this wasn't the end. They had stopped him for now, but the damage had been done. The city was in ruins, and the Varelians were still coming. They hadn't won the war, not yet. But this victory, this small moment of peace, was enough to give Jackson hope. They had a chance. They could still turn things around. The final battle was a brutal and relentless test of humanity's strength and resolve. With Vex now subdued and the immediate threat contained, Jackson and Sailor were far from out of danger. The Varelian forces, though momentarily halted, were regrouping. Their warships were assembling in orbit, and their ground forces were closing in on the city. The calm they had gained was temporary, just a brief respite before the storm. In the midst of it all, Jackson's mind raced. They had no choice but to confront the Varelians head-on or risk losing everything. The odds were stacked against them, but Jackson wasn't about to back down. They had already fought one monster. Now, they had to face an entire empire. They couldn't afford to hesitate. He turned to Sailor, who was already preparing for what was to come. The strategic command center had been hastily rebuilt, and they were making the final preparations for their counterattack. Jackson knew they needed to act fast before the Varelians could reorganize and mount a more effective assault. The weaponry they had scavenged from the wreckage was formidable, but it was nothing compared to the advanced technology the Varelians had. But Jackson wasn't relying on firepower alone. He had a plan. It wasn't about outmatching the Varelians. In terms of strength, it was about using their own weaknesses against them. The Varelians, despite their technological superiority, were too reliant on their advanced systems and arrogance. Jackson had seen that firsthand. The Empire's soldiers underestimated humans, always had, and that was the key. Sailor had gathered a small but fierce group of soldiers, and together they had designed a strategy that played on the Varelian reliance on their technology. It was a gamble, but it was the only option left. The clock was ticking. The Varelians were closing in on their position. Jackson moved quickly, rallying the remaining human resistance fighters. They had to be prepared for the worst. As the first wave of Varelian drones descended from the sky, Jackson issued his orders. They used the EMP devices to disable the Varelian surveillance systems, cloaking their movements and making them nearly invisible to enemy eyes. They moved quickly through the city's ruins, setting up hidden traps and ambushing the enemy when they least expected it. But the Varelians were not easily defeated. As their forces advanced, they deployed their own countermeasures, setting up energy shields and counteracting Jackson's tactics. The fight was fierce and unforgiving, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Sailor was right by Jackson's side, issuing orders and guiding their forces with unwavering precision. Despite the odds, they were making progress. Slowly but surely, the tide of battle began to shift. The Varelians' overconfidence was working against them. They had anticipated an easy victory, assuming their advanced technology would crush the human resistance. But they hadn't accounted for human ingenuity. As the ground forces moved closer, Jackson realized that the final phase of their plan was at hand. They had lured the Varelians into the heart of the city, into the very area that Jackson had prepared for a final, devastating strike. The EMP devices were set to overload, triggering a massive burst of energy that would cripple the Varelians. Technology for good. But there was a catch. Once activated, the EMP would knock out all electronic systems, including their own. It was a dangerous move. If anything went wrong, they would be left defenseless, vulnerable to a full-scale assault. There was no turning back now. As the Varelians advanced, Jackson gave the signal. Sailor activated the EMP. The explosion of energy was deafening. The air crackled with static as every piece of advanced Varelian technology went dark. There, drones fell from the sky. Their warships in orbit lost contact with the ground forces. The Varelians were thrown into disarray. The advantage was theirs. Humanity had just leveled the playing field, but the victory was short-lived. As Jackson and Sailor moved to press their advantage, the remaining Varelian troops, now cut off from their command, launched a desperate, final assault. The Varelians charged forward, relying on brute strength and hand-to-hand combat, but the humans were ready. The final showdown was a chaotic battle, with both sides fighting fiercely in the streets of the city. Jackson led the charge, his heart racing, his mind focused on nothing but victory. Sailor fought with the same tenacity, her eyes locked onto the enemy as she cut through their ranks. The battle seemed to last an eternity, but it was clear. Humanity was winning. The Varelians were no match for the ingenuity and resolve of the human resistance. In the final moments of the fight, Jackson found himself face to face with the Varelian commander, a towering figure whose presence alone sent a chill down his spine. The commander was a formidable opponent, wielding a blade that hummed with energy. The two clashed in a brutal life-or-death struggle. Jackson's muscles burned, his mind screaming for him to keep going. He couldn't stop now. With a final surge of strength, he disarmed the commander, sending the weapon flying. The Varelian leader collapsed to the ground, defeated. Jackson stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The battle was over. The Varelians had been repelled, and humanity had won. But it was not without a heavy price. The city was in ruins, and many lives had been lost. Yet in the midst of it all, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. The fight for survival had brought humanity together in ways he had never imagined. The human spirit, resilient and unyielding, had overcome the odds, and as Jackson stood amidst the wreckage, he knew that humanity's fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that victory was within their reach.